On the TED Radio Hour, law professor Nida Farahani says brain sensors may soon be able to read our innermost thoughts.
A world where what you're feeling can be decoded using AI and neurotechnology.
And that comes with huge risks.
If we don't have safeguards in place, what it means to flourish as a human may suddenly not be our own.
Brain Hacks, that's on the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. The battle over immigration is continuing in Congress and in the presidential campaign. States in the South and in the North are trying to manage the influx of more migrants than they can deal with, while there's a humanitarian crisis at the border. Migrants crossing the southern border, or trying to, used to be primarily from Mexico. Now they're primarily from Central and South America. Trump is promising that if he wins, he'll oversee the largest mass deportation in American history. My guest, Jonathan Blitzer, is the author of a new book about how today's crisis at the border connects with U.S. foreign policy and immigration policy, starting with the Cold War of the mid-1960s through the Reagan era, when the U.S. bolstered Latin American dictators in an attempt to prevent the spread of communism. He writes about the Trump administration as well. The book is told through the personal stories of three people and the choices they made to deal with or escape terror, corruption, and economic crises in their countries, and the consequences they faced. He also examines how their personal stories illustrate the history of American politics that helped create the crises in Central America. Blitzer is a staff writer at The New Yorker, covering immigration. His new book is called Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here: The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. We recorded our interview yesterday. Jonathan Blitzer, welcome back to Fresh Air. So I have to say that over the years, I've done a lot of interviews about how the U.S. helped bolster dictatorships in Central and South America to prevent the spread of communism, the logic being that the authoritarian rulers were keeping back the communists, and if they fell, communists would take over. I've also done a lot of interviews about, current immigration policy. Yours is the first book I've read, the first reporting that I remember seeing that connects the two, the support of U.S. dictatorships and the immigration crisis we're seeing now. What made you want to connect those two?
Well, a few things. The history of U.S. foreign policy and the history of U.S. immigration policy, which, of course, all revolves around domestic politics. It involves politics in the region and so on, really kind of unlocks the broader story. It not only clarifies what the reality has been for people in the region, for lawmakers in Washington and the U.S. borderlands, but it also sets up a historical parallel that's been very striking to me in the last several years, which is through the 1980s, say, you would have the U.S. supporting governments that opposed the spread of communism. And so it became very easy for these governments in the region to perpetrate all kinds of atrocities, knowing that the U.S. wasn't going to hold them to account because they were aligned on Cold War politics. Now, the latter-day manifestation of that has been an obsession with stemming the flow of migration from the region. And so there's a kind of a recurrence of U.S. governments looking the other way on a range of issues from corruption to state-perpetrated violence, because just as U.S. authorities were once easily swayed by reassurances from right-wing leaders that they would crack down on communism, now they're equally reassured that, okay, these partners are helping us combat the flow of people, and therefore we should make whatever allowances we have to make. And so the problem kind of perpetuates itself.
A White House official recently told you that immigration has become a democratic issue. What did he mean by that?
The idea is, in the U.S. now, we are obviously fighting the rise of populist authoritarianism. It's not just an American phenomenon, sadly. It's an international phenomenon. And nothing has really catalyzed that phenomenon quite like mass migration. This is an issue that the entire world is experiencing, not just in the U.S. We're in a moment of unprecedented mass migration and displacement, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Second World War. And one of the appeals that populist authoritarians have made is that our countries are under threat, that our borders are being overrun, and the immigration issue has tended to have this outsized impact over the broader political discourse. And so it's the kind of situation where it doesn't matter what other things an American administration might be doing domestically, the border, immigration at the border, the images of, border agents seeming to be overtaken, all the rest, that completely dominates public perceptions of how the government is working and operating. And so it really has this ability uniquely to be a kind of powder keg in our politics.
I think the White House official was also implying that authoritarian rulers use this to scare people into voting for them. And I'm wondering if you think that Trump falls into this category of exploiting the immigration crisis for his own good, and if that's the pattern that you see in authoritarian leaders around the world right now.
I definitely think so. And I think Trump is not only a paradigmatic case, but I think on a scale and with a ferocity and at a volume that we've never really seen before in the modern era, he has weaponized this issue. And once he's made the kinds of claims that he's made, the sort of bottom falls out in our political discourse to some degree. I mean, the only thing keeping leaders from making this very cynical appeal and not is, frankly, a sense of integrity and scruples. I mean, none of the facts align with what Donald Trump is saying about immigration. Just the most obvious one being that immigrants bring crime. I mean, all of these things he says are demonstrably false. What's complicated about it is immigration is real. The numbers of people fleeing their countries and arriving at the southern border, that's a fact. It's a fact of our world. And so, it's a very easy issue to exploit. And once everyone in the world has seen someone exploit it as successfully as Donald Trump, it becomes irresistible to a certain segment of the world's political population to do the same.
You read that for more than a century, the U.S. has devised one policy after another to keep people out of the country, and for more than a century, it has failed. Certainly recently, a lot of the policy to keep people out of the country has been deterrence. This is especially true during the Trump administration, creating really harsh policies, including the separation of parents from children, as a deterrence to other people who were thinking of crossing the border into the U.S., seeking asylum. And you say, that has totally failed. And you offer an example of that in your book. You visited a housing complex in Mexico where people were trying to enter the U.S. And a lot of the people who you met there had already been in the U.S., hadn't gotten asylum, and spent time in prison. So tell us about those people and why they were still, after being deported from the U.S., trying to get back in, after being imprisoned in the U.S., trying to get back in.
This was at a housing complex along the southern border of Mexico and Guatemala. And often you have these kinds of sort of echoes through time and space where, you can best understand the dynamics of the U.S.-Mexico border by talking to people at the Mexico-Guatemala border. There are these kinds of international reverberations. And what was so striking about my conversation with this group of people was that everyone had been, detained, imprisoned, some for longer than others, and deported. And all of them had horrible experiences in American immigration detention. And all of them, to a person, described feeling the immediate need as soon as they touched back down in their home country, in this particular case it was Honduras, to make the journey again. And what was so jarring to me about it was the kind of realization that you have a global population now that kind of fits a different model than anything I had ever thought about before, which was, these people technically are Honduran, but they can't live in Honduras. The poverty was too extreme. The political corruption was too extreme. There's a history of political repression that in some individual cases had touched these people personally. So none of them thought life in Honduras was sustainable. And yet, anytime they got to the U.S., they were immediately apprehended and imprisoned. And so, it didn't matter what kind of punishment was meted out at the U.S. border when there is an overwhelming desperation to emigrate, when there's an overwhelming need. The cost-benefit analysis is always going to be to flee to safety, to flee to opportunity. And it's been, extremely painful to document over the years deterrence policies that sort of on paper would seem to make sense. It sort of stands to reason that the tougher you are at the border, the more people would take stock and try to adapt accordingly. But the kind of human reality is that if you have a desperate need to leave, you're going to leave and you're going to sort things out later.
Why is the story no longer about Mexican migrants trying to cross the border into the U.S., but it's more about Central and South America. What changed?
Around 2014, and obviously these things are slower rolling phenomena, but around 2014, you started to see this shift where, the typical profile of the person arriving at the U.S. southern border up to that moment was a single Mexican adult crossing to look for work. And that was an easier population for the U.S. to deal with administratively. When someone comes to the border seeking protection in the form of asylum, the government by law is required to hear out their claim and to process that claim, which of course requires resources and attention. And so around that inflection point in 2014, you started to see this shift where, that single Mexican male crossing for work subsided somewhat and was replaced and in fact vastly eclipsed by unaccompanied children from Central America and families from Central America. And all of them were seeking asylum. So what was happening in Central America was endemic violence that had really reached a point where life was more or less uninhabitable in these countries. I mean, massive gang violence, which, by the way, was the result of U.S. deportation policy in the 1990s. So this is to the broader point of how U.S. foreign policy plays a role in all of this. Continued government failures to stem violence, all of these things building in the region. And so in a certain sense, why 2014 in particular? The deeper I got in the reporting, the clearer it became to me that really those were factors that were accumulating in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. It was building steadily. And then it kind of screamingly announces itself at the southern border in 2014 when U.S. authorities are almost literally overnight overwhelmed by the numbers of people. Now, of course, in retrospect, the numbers of people arriving seem relatively tame. But at the moment, it was a massive crisis. And the U.S. government was really struggling to come up with ways of handling that kind of population that needed to be tended to because they were seeking asylum.
Now, you said that the gangs in Central and South America that people are fleeing from, those gangs are a result of U.S. deportation policy. Can you connect the dots for us?
Yeah, so the story, I mean, it's kind of quite an amazing thing to think about now, especially when during the Trump years, we heard almost daily about the Salvadoran street gang MS-13. That gang started on the streets of Los Angeles. The dates sort of are variable, but, some people date the kind of rise of MS-13 as we know it today, more or less, to the mid to late 80s. Basically what had happened was this. In the 1980s, there was a civil war in El Salvador that went from basically 1980 to 1992, and it displaced a huge portion of the Salvadoran population. Basically a fifth of El Salvador fled to the United States. So you had, every several months, you had hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans kind of washing into American cities. And as they did, they were brutalized by a pretty vicious inner city racial hierarchy, where as the newcomers, they were, victims of crime, of beatings, of killings. And so over time, what you started to see in Los Angeles, in South Los Angeles at the time, was some of these Salvadoran new arrivals forming groups of their own in self-defense. Now, obviously, there was kind of a complicated and rich gang landscape in California at that time. And so they kind of linked up with different elements of the population and over time started to commit crimes in their own right. This is how gangs like MS-13 formed. But over time, as the U.S. government started to crack down on crime, and remember, the 1990s were all about politically proving federal toughness on crime. So you had the war on crime in inner cities across America converging with a political imperative to show toughness on immigration and to link the two. And the U.S. started to deport large numbers of these gang members to El Salvador without really telling El Salvador who it was that they were sending back. Now, El Salvador, of course, was just reeling from over 12 years of civil war. 75,000 people had just been killed. The country was in, shambles. And so in relatively short order, these criminal elements started to consolidate their power in post-Civil War El Salvador, gain in strength, and start to really metastasize throughout the region. And that's the gang threat that we've come to see now.
So, in other words, the people who came to the U.S. and had no opportunities and became gang leaders, and were then imprisoned and then deported, go back to El Salvador, and the life they know at this point is a criminal gang kind of life. And do gang leaders become part of the government or part of the massive corruption?
What we see most particularly with the gang situation in places like El Salvador and Honduras is that it's almost like a parallel state. The governments were weak or corrupt, and didn't have effective responses to rising crime. And so you had kind of what emerged was a parallel state where, the rule on the street was wrought by gangs. And, the type of crime they engaged in, I mean, a lot of it was violent, homicidal stuff. But a lot of it also was less drug dealing early on than extortion. And so, demanding taxes from local businesses. So if you ran a local store, you'd have to kick a certain amount of the money you made to the local gang.
Standard American organized crime.
Exactly. And it really bled dry the economy. I mean, tens of millions of dollars over the years were tied up in extortion rackets. And so, as the power of these gangs really hardened and became more entrenched in Central American society, governments made allowances for them. I mean, it got to a point where, the situation in El Salvador has changed pretty drastically in recent years, but you would have Salvadoran governments secretly negotiating with these gang members around election time to try to persuade them to lower the homicide rate during the election season, as a way of obviously boosting the political prospects of the ruling party. And so you had all these kinds of unsavory alliances. But the gangs really were a kind of independent operator. And to come back to the question also of, what it meant for people showing up at the southern border, it also scrambled the equation a little bit in terms of how American immigration law could deal with a humanitarian emergency. So asylum, the principle of asylum, which was first enshrined in 1980 in U.S. law and was a part of international law for longer, defined very specific forms of persecution that triggered eligibility for asylum. Identity-based persecution, and typically that had more to do with the predations of a government, of the state.
What you're describing also connects to asylum law. Asylum law was written in 1980?
Mm-hmm.
And what was it written to address then that isn't quite working now?
Well, there were a few things in the codifying of asylum law in America that kind of didn't line up with the reality at the border and beyond. The first is this. The idea of asylum was predicated on very specific forms of persecution. So if someone were the victim of particular kinds of identity-based persecution, usually perpetrated by the state, they typically had a good shot of earning legal protection in the form of asylum. What that definition didn't immediately account for was something like the phenomenon of these gangs, which isn't the state as such, and which obviously submerges a country in daily violence, but doesn't map very neatly onto identity-based persecution. So maybe someone has been threatened, they've had family members killed or hunted down because one of them had insulted a local gang leader or had refused to pay a tax on their business. And the gang has such a national reach in the country that there was no easy way to escape the predations of this particular gang. That's horrific and is quite literally life-threatening for someone. It would seem very obvious that that kind of person would qualify for asylum, but it's not written as cleanly into the statute that basically would have, spelled out more specific forms of persecution that would make them eligible for protection. So that was an immediate complication. Another was that asylum deals with people who arrive at the southern border seeking protection, which means that it's essentially an unpredictable population of people who show up. The 1980 Refugee Act, which codified asylum law, was focused more specifically on a population of refugees who the U.S. could bring into the country, could vet in their home countries or in other countries that they had fled to, and controlled their arrival in the U.S.
Like Russia, dissidents in Russia.
Exactly.
And Jews from Russia.
Exactly. So, there were populations that, in the past, there wasn't a kind of formal system for how the U.S. dealt with broad populations like that. And so the idea of the 1980 Refugee Act was to say, okay, we are going to come up with a set of, humanitarian criteria for protections that people deserved, and we are going to extend that protection to people abroad and bring them to the U.S. Administratively, asylum was much more complicated because it was a function of who showed up at the border. And so what the framers of the 1980 Act couldn't have accounted for, and what indeed they did not account for, was that those numbers over time would soar, and that asylum as such would be slow to keep up with that pace of mass arrivals.
Well, let's take another short break here. If you're just joining us, my guest is Jonathan Blitzer. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker who covers immigration. His new book is called Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. We'll be right back. I'm Terry Gross, and this is Fresh Air.
NPR Plus is a new way to support public media and get more from your favorite NPR podcasts like Fresh Air.
Sometimes I'll actually preface the question with, if it makes you too uncomfortable to talk about, if it's too personal, just tell me. Here's the question.
For behind-the-scenes content, bonus episodes, and more, sign up at plus.npr.org.
Hey everybody, it's Peter Sagal, host of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. We're trying really hard to get 401 new Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me Plus supporters in the month of February. And to make this plea a little tastier, we're going to grant you some extra fun episodes. Head to plus.npr.org and sign up for Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me Plus to hear the most mouth-watering show on public radio today.
Support for this podcast comes from the Neubauer Family Foundation, supporting WHYY's Fresh Air and its commitment to sharing ideas and encouraging meaningful conversation.
This message comes from the New Yorker Radio Hour. Editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, presents a mix of profiles and storytelling that the publication is known for every Tuesday and Friday. Listen and follow the New Yorker Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, it's Tanya Mosley, back with another sneak peek at the kinds of exclusive bonus extras only available on our Fresh Air Plus feed.
But all I can tell you is, before I walked out there, the little girl in me was like,
You had a moment.
I couldn't believe what I was about to get to do.
That's an outtake from my recent conversation with Tracy Ellis Ross, and I share more and explain what made this interview so meaningful to me with my colleague Anne-Marie Baldonado on the latest Fresh Air Plus bonus episode. You can hear and join for yourself at plus.npr.org.
Let's get back to the interview I recorded yesterday with Jonathan Blitzer, author of the new book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. The crisis is the immigration crisis. He covers immigration for The New Yorker, where he's a staff writer. His new book is about how the current immigration crisis in the U.S. and at the southern border is connected with American foreign policy dating back to the Cold War of the mid-'60s through the Reagan administration. He also writes about more recent immigration issues, including what happened during the Trump administration. Your book tells the stories of three people who are in great danger in Central American countries. And through those stories, you tell the larger story of how American policy has affected the countries that they're fleeing from. And also you tell the story of how they dealt with the crises. So the first story that you tell is the story of Juan Romagoza. Why did you choose his story? In other words, what I'm asking you is, what were you hoping his story would illustrate in terms of the larger story of the immigration crisis?
You know, Juan fled El Salvador in the early 1980s. He had been brutalized and tortured by the National Guard at the time. He was a doctor by training, was tortured so badly that he couldn't continue to perform surgeries, and that was the whole idea of the torture that he was subjected to, that it was meant to incapacitate him. He fled, lived in Mexico for a few years while he physically recuperated. During that time, helped Guatemalan refugees fleeing the civil war in Guatemala travel through Mexico to reach the United States. Juan eventually makes it to the U.S., gets involved with the sanctuary movement, first in California, then in Washington, D.C., and over time becomes a major public health kind of leader of the community in Washington, D.C. at a storied medical clinic called La Clinica, catering to primarily undocumented Central Americans living in Washington. So he kind of is in every place you would want someone to be in order to understand the different strands of this story, and winds up actually testifying in a U.S. federal court in the early 2000s in a human rights case involving two war criminals, Salvadoran generals, who had fled to the United States, were relocated by the CIA and the State Department in the U.S., and who eventually were found guilty of committing human rights violations. And in 2015,